Glenn, I have always appreciated your feel for the whole area of social ethics. I think that you demonstrate a fine social consciousness and awareness of the great problems of our time in terms of peace and justice. Been a person who wants to work on those things, committed to achieving justice. And I have a feeling as though part of your own interest along that line stems from a great American theologian by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr. At least I believe I detect in your style and approach and some of the things you try to do sort of tinges of Niebuhr's thought, and therefore I'd like to talk with you a little bit about Niebuhr. Have I analyzed that correctly?
I think you have, Jim, in several respects, but there's another additional point that we'll get in as we move along.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about this great American theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, born in the early 1880s, the son of a Protestant minister, and educated at Eden Seminary in St. Louis, got his master's degree in theology at Yale, served as a pastor in his father's church for a while after his father's death, and then was appointed a pastor up in Detroit, Michigan, served there for 13 years, and went to Union Theological in New York to teach in 1928, where he was associated with Union Theological through all those years until his death in 1971. People were always trying to lure him away. Harvard tried for years to get him to take a position there, but he stayed at Union Theological throughout all of his theological career. So we're dealing with a man of immense influence. Many would call him the greatest American theologian that we've ever produced. Clearly the most influential in the whole political economic fields. And a man who received great recognition during his lifetime. He was on the lecture circuit and wrote important books and was in great demand on the cover of Time magazine, all of those kind of things that seem to be the indications of status or having made it in our culture. So we're dealing with an immensely important figure, and one whose life now is becoming back to us through a great biography by Richard Fox, Reinhold Niebuhr, a biography. We wouldn't say a definitive biography, but he certainly has covered all the bases, and it's given us a renewed interest in this great man's thought. And what I'd like to do a bit is we look at his life and especially deal with his political philosophy, his approach to the economic questions, and all of his social involvement. So maybe we can begin to reflect along that line.
Okay, Jim. I think it's very timely. Reinhold Niebuhr is a man of our times.
Yes.
And I think he would fit right in today and see many of the same problems and makes many of the same critiques of our period as he did throughout his own lifetime.
You know, it would be fun to do, Glenn, is just to pick out an issue or a number of issues and say, what would Niebuhr write about it in Christianity in Crisis if he was still writing now?
Oh, he would have a lovely time with the moral majority and some of the, as he calls it, some of the moral pretensions of our administration and of some of our economic leaders of the time, that we are on a healthy binge right now economically, and everything's looking up and getting better, and the human situation, human condition is we're much better off than we were 4 years ago. You know, that sort. He would have more fun with that today than probably
there would be some very harsh rhetoric coming out of him about the moral majority and some of its leaders. That is pretty clear, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
And now, when you get the thing about Niebuhr and social questions was that he was tricky. That is, you often could not predict exactly what he would say about a given topic.
Emil Brunner called him. Some people call him a neo-fundamentalist or a neo-orthodox. In fact, he's kind of credited with starting the neo-orthodox movement. He didn't like that, and Emil Brunner says he would much have preferred radical Protestant. And he was the most unorthodox of the type.
Yes, that's right. And he did hate that some people called him a fundamentalist, and I think that got him more angry than about anything else. But it would be tricky to take some other situations, like Nicaragua now. That would be one to ask ourselves what he would be doing. I don't know if we really want to get into that.
Well,
but
I think what we can do
take a stab at it. What would he say?
Is take his approach to, which we're, I think, generally known as Christian realism. And he would see that there's plenty of room probably on both sides, the Reagan side as well as the Sandinista side, to infuse a critique that would go somewhere along the line that we're all humans in this situation, and we're all pushing toward our own prideful interests and willing to our own power. And as that is the case, neither side will give up power without being confronted by an equal power or a more dominant power, and will not give it up willingly. The Reagan administration isn't going to back off. They are putting their whole administrative posture on the line here, and the power and pride of that posture is very much at stake. From the Sandinista side, from the Nicaraguan Sandinista side, you have the same kind of thing. And he would say it's Marxist imbued for one thing, and he'd have a critique of the Marxist position, as he did. Interestingly enough, his first book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, was a kind of an uncritical Marxist statement. But he backed away from that, and then became very critical of the Marxist position, unqualified later in some of his later writings, seeing in it an idolatrous posture, for one thing, prideful self-will, even as it allegedly, as he put it, tried to enhance the stature of man, and that was an era when we talked about man and not the human family.
One of the things that that I get out of what you just said is that it would make a difference what era we were talking about. Like if we would take the Niebuhr who wrote in the early 30s and put it, and signed him to the Nicaragua case, I think what he would be extremely critical of our government. He would say, get out, no more aid to the Contras, leave those people alone, this is part of American imperialism, we have to draw back, and so on. He would be extremely harsh. If we took him at his post-Second World War time, when he became very fearful of communism, in a lot of the writings of the 50s, for example, I think then he adopted then the position that we sort of had to contain communism around the world and had to show great firmness. And he may well have responded differently to Nicaragua, I think, out of that period. But you can get all kind of arguments about this now, because that's what surely everybody who's reviving Niebuhr's thought is claiming him as their own. And everybody sees a different side of him. He was very complex. And as you suggested, he really changed his mind often throughout his life as he talked about these great social questions. There was one whole book that he completely repudiated. Somebody attacked him for what he said in that book, and he says, I repudiate everything in that whole book. So that he was not above changing his mind at all.
He critiqued himself often, and that's part of the beauty of his style. He grew through the pages of history. As history changed. He was not inflexible. In fact, if there is a common thread, it would be the thread that he critiqued any absolute position.
I agree with that.
If someone is coming down hard and fast with an absolute dogmatic position, then Niebuhr would raise his head and have a real question about that.
That's exactly right. I think that he was a prophet in that sense, or an iconoclast. He needed to break down all of the absolutes, and he felt that was our pride at work. Let's look at some of these issues, the way he developed. He was a pastor for 13 years in a Detroit parish. It was a middle-class parish. But he did have run-ins over the labor movement of the time. There was a time when he got into big fights with Henry Ford, for example. He thought that Henry Ford's humanitarian outlook was often a posturing, and that the working men were not doing that well in the Ford industry and so on. So he had a feel for the working man. I think the economic questions influenced him through his life. He was definitely on the side of the working class and wanted to build them up and to make sure that they were able to secure their rights. As you suggested, he was convinced that you wouldn't do it through love. In other words, he learned that you couldn't tell Henry Ford just to love people, or anybody who had power just to exercise Christian love, that just wouldn't work. He became convinced that the love ethic didn't really apply in that way in social relationships, that it was power that made a difference, and that therefore what we needed to deal with was the question of justice. And the justice would be served by enabling people to secure power, to get power for themselves so that they could function in society with some influence and work out what he would call approximate justice. Not a perfect justice, we could never get that, but we would try to move in that direction. So I think there was a time when some of the labor union leaders came to Detroit and they were going to speak in the churches, and the government officials somehow blocked that. And he always remembered that. that there was power in government to block that kind of free exchange, and that wasn't good. One had to be able to fight against that. And so there would be one area at least that we could probe.
Well, let's trace that a little bit, because I think it's in the beginning of his ministry and of his coming to national prominence.
So we're talking here about in the 20s.
This is 1919, 1920, and he wanted to open up his church for a labor organizing meeting. And as you indicated, this was blocked in not only his church but in several churches. And part of this was because he had had a run-in with Henry Ford already. There was a great deal of writing going around, PR writing for the Ford company, about how generous Henry Ford was with his $5 a day for the auto workers. And the one thing that Reinhold Niebuhr began to do was debunk, and that's put in quote, debunk the moral pretensions of Henry Ford in this light, and point out that this generosity really was a false generosity, because what was left out of the picture were enforced vacations for the workers. Just without any conscience, the Ford industry would just close down and enforce vacations on the workers. Also, extended leaves up to a half of a year for the workers at Ford for what was called and is called retooling of the plant as new models came into existence. Well, he saw the intolerable conditions of poverty that caused, and dislocation of families, and the high suicide rate among workers and people in his own parish. And so he really began to question this in the crucible of the forming of the labor movement of this country, particularly the auto industry labor movement.
Right, and it moved him to take some strong positions. As we know, after he went to Union to teach in 1928, he really was an avowed socialist during that time. In fact, he supported socialist candidates for president all the way along the line until we get up to the time of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he also ran for Congress himself on a socialist ticket in 1932. And so Niebuhr was very involved in socialist politics. He really felt that represented a better way to manage our affairs and to work out some sort of economic justice. In fact, as you suggested, I think before, he employed Marxist categories to look at the whole question. It was in the early 30s that he published one of his two most famous works, Moral Man and Immoral Society, where he really works out this whole thesis that societies and groups work only according to self-interest. That I use that sort of homely example where an individual could be moved by the face of a starving child to pity and to maybe change something and to help. That institutions, organizations, corporations, countries don't see that face of that starving child. They simply work out of their own momentum, their own self-interest, and that we have to take that into consideration. We're not going to get any place unless we remember that. And I think that's probably the major thesis of Moral Man and Immoral Society. Societies somehow are worse than individuals. Means that pride, greed, selfishness has gotten embedded somehow in these institutions. They have a life of their own, and unless we confront them with power, they will never change.
That's right. He was an organizer in this period too, Jim, of a group called the Fellowship of Socialist Christians, and it was that kind of support body that helped him make that political run.
In fact, he was always organizing.
That's right.
Always getting together some new group, organizing a periodical like Christianity in Crisis, or a new peace group, new socialist group.
Incredible. And let's say something about Moral Men and Immoral Society. He was criticized largely, widely for that book, somewhat around the title of it. It was not the title he proposed. It was the title chosen by the publisher. It was criticized on the basis that it looked as if he was saying that individual man is a moral man, corporate or social man is a sinful man, and that's not what he's saying at all. He's saying that man, generally, the human family, really is in a condition, a sinful condition. The pride is the center, makeup of the human family, and the will to power. Now, what happens is you get you compound that will to power, that pridefulness, that sinfulness, as you compound the human family. That is, as you get them in social collectives of one kind or another, institutions, churches, schools, political associations, governments. That just compounds the sinful nature and the distancing from justice. And you really have to work at blocking power and challenging power at every step as you compound the social fabric of the human family. And he is very, very interesting that that none of those institutions, none of those groupings of the social fabric will give up power willingly. It always has to be challenged.
Made a telling critique of that in terms of the racial situation in the United States long before other people saw this. He said the white majority will never give position, status, or power to the blacks. And that
See how it influenced Martin Luther King?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, blacks had to achieve power. They had to have power, political, economic kind of power, if they were going to make any kind of progress. It's interesting the way he critiqued Gandhi in this way, because many people thought of Gandhi as using love force and not power to achieve his ends. And Niebuhr debunked Gandhi in many ways. I think he would make many people mad for whom Gandhi is a hero, but he said that Gandhi was really a practical political pragmatist and knew how to get things done, and that he was really working not out of a love ideal ethic, but a very practical approach to how to achieve an end, that is, the political freedom and liberation of India. And that Gandhi really knew how to do this, and he was a man of force or power. In fact, Gandhi's word, satyagraha, truth force or truth power, probably brings that out. Absolutely. So Niebuhr saw power at work no matter where it was going on, even in somebody like Gandhi, who espoused supposedly a totally pacifist position. Niebuhr really got involved in all kind of questions, but as he went on, we must point out that he didn't remain a strict socialist throughout his life. By the time of the 30s, when Roosevelt was running, he supported Roosevelt in, I think, every election, all four that Roosevelt ran in, he voted for him. Did not vote for the socialist candidates during that time. In fact, disassociated himself from the Socialist Party at one time. And moved, I guess, what many people would think of as to maybe more moderate position on these kind of questions.
Again, I think it was because of the self-posturing of that movement, of the kind of pretentious self-righteousness that he saw there, that we are right and they are wrong kind of posturing that went on, and he did distance himself from that movement. He and moved into this into political pragmatism or realism. And that's where he had his influence on more recent political history. He influenced Arthur Schlesinger, advisor to John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy read him. Even Castro in Cuba has said that he has been influenced by Niebuhr's writings.
There's a famous statement by George Kennan that all of the political realists in the United States, he says that Niebuhr is the father of us all. And I guess that Kennan has denied making that statement in the recent past, but Niebuhr was clearly influential on a lot of the political philosophy, and there were a whole group of people involved in government who sort of began to take on his style or approach to world affairs, where you had to say that, we had to deal with power blocks, we had to realize that self-interest was always at work, and we couldn't go in as moral crusaders. We had to remember the harsh realities that were at work and so on. There's a whole outlook, I guess, or style. These people were even influenced by Niebuhr to saying that our view of human nature had to be taken into consideration, that if the Soviets have a different view of human nature, it's going to affect the way they operate generally. In fact, when Niebuhr finally got down to it, he ended up criticizing Marxism for the same reasons he criticized a lot of rationalism and idealism. Absolutely. That is, that it's utopian, it's dreamy, it's up in the clouds, it doesn't take into account the sinfulness of human nature. So that Marx thought as soon as we would get the economics right, structure right, the classless society, everything would be beautiful and non-competitive. We'd all get along and live in harmony. And what Niebuhr saw was that was utopian. That isn't how it is. Human nature itself is flawed. As you well pointed out, the title of the book could mislead you there. In fact, his brother, H. Richard Niebuhr, who was also a famous theologian and taught at Yale, criticized Reinhold's Moral Man and Immoral Society because it did not show enough of the way pride and self-interest works at the individual level. And I think Reinhold, worked that out and took his brother's criticism very seriously. My impression is more seriously than any of the other theologians. They were very close.
Very close.
Yes, and he really did listen to his brother, and I think did gradually revise his thought. And there, instead of being sort of a Marxist in a way, he became very critical of Marxism and of communism, and after the Second World War, of Soviet expansionism. And that's why many liberals sort of lost touch with Niebuhr at that time. Harvey Cox, for example, a Baptist liberal theologian, has written that he didn't know what to make of the later Niebuhr. He loved Moral Man and Immoral Society. He read it in one night. He was so influenced by it. But when Niebuhr started into his tremendous anti-communism bit, they weren't so sure about him. In fact, a lot of people criticize him for not getting on Joseph McCarthy sooner or in stronger fashion, although he eventually did criticize McCarthy for his witch hunts and so on.
Well, my own mentor, and this is the point that I said I'd bring up later, is John Swamley, who is just retired from St. Paul's School of Theology in Kansas City, ran Fellowship of Reconciliation 20 years after Niebuhr left, and had an ongoing battle with him, particularly in those early years, about Niebuhr leaving the pacifist camp. And the critique still stands, and I think Swamley now, to some degree at least, has changed his view about his own pacifist position, not seeing it so absolute, but seeing it tempered with human pride and willfulness, as well as any other movement. And
well, that's very interesting to me. Is that right? That would he say that Niebuhr was influential on him in that, or?
I'm not sure he would go that far, but I do think, just in hearing Swamley lecture more recently, that he has tempered his absolutist views some.
Yeah. So just to clarify that, Niebuhr did. Well, I would say he never was a total pacifist. I don't think. He really he ended up supporting the war effort in World War I and in World War II, although he had tinges of regret about it. He would visit a military camp and saw them doing the bayonet practice, and just was revolted by that and wondered if he really wanted to support this war effort or not. So, I mean, when it came down to the actual wars that we fought in, he supported them, except the Vietnam War.
Right, he's one of the early critics.
Yes, he opposed the war in Vietnam. I think he supported the war in Korea, however.
I believe so.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and I think the whole nuclear question came into play in Vietnam and or after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that began to change even Niebuhr's point of view. And there's a large debate in the literature about Niebuhr's position and whether he had become a nuclear pacifist or not following the dropping of those two bombs. But it's I just wanted to dwell a minute, Jim, if we might, on the love-justice dialectic, because that's so important in Niebuhr's thought. And it gets us into the more positive side of Niebuhr, too, I think. Many criticize him for being a cynic and a kind of a dismal kind of figure in theology because of this emphasis upon pride and human sinfulness. But the hope and joy in Niebuhr comes in this love-justice dialectic. He sees justice, as you indicated earlier, as a proximate love in society. That's the only way we can achieve love in society is to approximate it. But what you're approximating is the Christ love, is the love that comes crashing into history in the Christ event. And this is very Niebuhrian at this point. He sees the Christ event in history as God, man reaching up to his limits and being fulfilled at the same time by this love event in history. And whatever we attempt to do then by law to regulate our human propensity to sin, that is to will our power over others, and that's basically what the criminal justice system is about. That's what crime is about. We're willing our power over some other form, property or human. And justice then flows in at the point that we approximate some mercy and love in the system. And he sees that in race relations. He sees it in economic redistribution of wealth systems. He sees it in war and peace questions. And it just becomes a kind of a paramount dialectical theme throughout his writing.
Yes, it is indeed. And I'm glad that you brought out the positive side of this, because we must remember he is a strong believing Christian and a strongly biblically based theologian. And he was convinced that God's mercy triumphed in the world, that always sin and guilt were part of the human situation, but grace was at work there as well. And they were sort of vying throughout history. And the real question always was, would there be enough mercy, in a sense, to overcome this guilt and sin? And for him, Jesus Christ, death and resurrection of Christ, represented the triumph of grace. And it was a reminder to us and the guarantee to us that God's mercy would be stronger than all of the lack of righteousness that was in the world. So he was a strongly biblically based figure.
Yeah, and very strong on the faith people that come, that believe in this event. I want to lift up...
Glenn, you're going to have to do it quickly.
Oh, okay.
You have only a few seconds.
Well, let's just say that the mercy element is proximate also, and he wants that in there as the element of hope that he leaves with us.
Glenn, we've been trying to look at Reinhold Niebuhr a bit, a great 20th century theologian, Protestant out of the evangelical church, marvelous influence on history, very much concerned about economic, political questions, and one who insisted on a Christian realism, that we had to take seriously the question of sin in the world, and that institutions had to deal with power. But always God's mercy would end up being stronger in the long run at the end of history.